Shaun is here. We want to thank Shaun very much for putting this workshop together and presenting today. And it is about storytelling and how to incorporate that into your writing. So I'll hand it over to Shaun.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. Everyone can see my screen. Welcome to Storytelling 101. Yep, okay, fantastic. So yeah, welcome to Storytelling 101. I think Kristen gave it a much better title. Speaking on that short and sweet note, I just gotta have it in very simple slides. But really it's about the power of storytelling in your work, in your business, in storytelling for your clients, whatever it may be. It's one of the world's oldest traditions, and one that still resonates with us today. And so we'll talk about that, unpack that a bit. What we're going to do today. So I'm going to cover my story, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm covering my story a little bit. We'll talk about why we tell stories. We'll talk about how stories are important, and we'll look at a couple tips of really how to tell those stories well. So my first career was in journalism. Journalism was all that I ever wanted. I was the editor of the elementary school paper. I was editor of the high school paper. I remember interviewing, the head of the Parents Association in like the 6th grade and grilling her on questions about, school funding. And she's looking at me going, "What's wrong with you, child?" It's a really strong memory. I got into journalism program after high school. I wound up getting sick. I had to leave. I went back in for grad school. I had an internship at the national broadcaster, the CBC, up here in Canada, kind of our version of NPR. And I was producing, some of their biggest radio programs for a bit. And it was literally my dream job. It was everything that I'd ever wanted. I loved radio for the storytelling, and I had the best time. So what happened? I finished the internship. There was really no work to be found, and I hit a wall. I spent months searching. There were no jobs, just nothing. I wound up falling to work with an international recruiting firm, of all things, while I figured out my next adventure. And then I went to law school. Dumb. Or the Law and Order. Dumb. Law was, my wife watches a lot of Law and Order, so that sound is kind of burned into my brain these days. Law was always the plan B. My mother had gone to law school, and she stopped practicing when I was born. I was always taught that law was a great start to learn how to do something else. So that was the approach that I took. Figured I'd practice for a couple of years and then see, where the wind took me. I loved law school, and I quickly realized how much of law was about storytelling. Law school teaches you to focus on these arcane legal principles. Some of them, I'm not kidding, from Shakespeare time, from the 1500s and 1600s, that you're still learning these cases going, why am I still learning this? But the reality of the actual practice of law is that any case is a story. How did it happen? How did things get to that point? If it's a decision from, a court of appeal or the Supreme Court, there's so much time and money and conviction that gets spent into, formulating that case. What's the story behind it all? Who are the people involved? There's a lot of stories there. So I practiced law for a couple of years, and what happened? To be honest, it wasn't great. I practiced employment law, so I was working both with employers and employees. I loved helping people. I loved the one-on-one. I was really able to help clients tell their stories, and in some cases get their great results. Really, what legal advocacy is you're helping your client tell their story, and you're helping them put their best foot forward in how they're telling their story. There's going to be facts on your side, facts that aren't, but you're really trying to sort of tell the best story that you possibly can. I joke with my business now that I used to be a lawyer, and the only difference today is that the stories are true. What I hated about law, and if you saw that video, I really did. I hated the fighting for its own sake. I hated how long everything took, and I hated the stress of practice. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I left. I actually left, came back, left again. I wound up doing some contract legal review work while I figured out my next steps. And thankfully, those next steps all started to come together. So where am I today? I started my own business on basically a lark. I sort of hung my shingle and said, hey, maybe there's some interest in this. I put out an open call for anyone who needed writing help and help telling their stories. I had written, previously for firms that I was with. I had my own blog that won a couple national blog awards. I knew that I could write, And so I figured, you know what? What's the worst that could happen? Suddenly I had my first client and then a few more. And they started referring business. And over the past, my goodness, almost 3 years now, which is just like goes by in a snap. It's become this thriving business that I get to help businesses of all size, in all different industries, tell their stories better in a way that's really engaging for the audience. I'm incredibly fortunate to get to do what I do, and I get to help so many people in a way that I truly enjoy. The business does everything from web copy to blogs, newsletters, articles, ebooks, reports. It's every day is a new adventure with something new altogether. So here's the golden question. Why am I telling you this? It's not a seminar about me. So what is it about? Is seminal to everything that you do. If you are in any sort of business, it's about those relationships. And in order to build relationships, people have to know you, like you, and trust you. So think about the relationship that we're building right now, having this conversation. In order for you to trust anything that I'm saying today, you need to know me and you need to like me. And so what I've done now is I've let you into my world a little bit, so you know me. And even if I'm being a little presumptuous here, hopefully you like me. I don't know. I'll go out on a limb and hope for that one. Know, like, and trust is the name of the game. We tell stories because they build those relationships quickly. And in a connection-based world, you have to build your connections fast. You only have a few minutes or sometimes only even a few seconds to engage someone and catch their attention. That know, like, and trust have to happen in the blink of an eye. That's why if you really want someone to open up in a short conversation, get their story. Ask them questions about themselves that really show that you're interested. It's amazing how much you can get someone to open up to you and tell you what they really want, what they really need once they know, like, and trust you. Business isn't B2B or B2C. It's human to human. I read this over the summer and it really stuck with me. We think of sales and business development in these, binary, very segmented terms. And I think that's such an outdated approach. Whether you're talking to a business or an individual customer or a client, we're all human at the end of the day. With so many of us operating side hustles, or when our side hustle becomes our main hustle, and taking off, as solopreneurs, the lines blur anyway. We are our business is us, and that's the case with a lot of folks here. To be effective, you and your business both need that human touch, and storytelling is what can really help you get there. I mentioned in the beginning that the stories are some of our oldest traditions because they stick with us. They implant in our brain. We remember them. They stay. The history of oral tradition, in so many cultures of passing down from generation to generation. It's, Canada's very proud of and, trying to really work hard at, acknowledging our Indigenous past. And it's such a proud facet of our Indigenous people's cultures where we are, and cultures around the world as well. We tell stories because they're just so natural to us, and we connect with them on this deeper level that's hard to explain. Everybody's got a story. And, I used to be the guy, if I met someone at a party, in my teens and 20s, I'd say, "What's your story?" They say, "I don't have a story." No. Everybody's got a story. Some of us grew up learning that our stories don't matter, which, I think couldn't be further from the truth. Case in point, I had this client that I was working with last year. We had met through a networking site, and we were talking about her business. She runs a small company in the US with two other women. They're a proudly certified women-based business out of Florida. They work in educational consulting. And we were talking about work. And she told me how they tried hiring a writer to help them redo their website. And they found this guy, I forget how they found him, but one of the first things that he told them is, "Your stories don't matter. Your stories don't matter, and no one cares." And when I heard that, it was like a dagger through my heart. I was absolutely gutted because it couldn't be further from the truth. It completely crushed me. These are three very smart, powerful, successful women who have, come from the classroom to start this large scale business. Their stories are everything. Their stories are such a defining part of the work that they do and of who they are. Who in their right mind, and he couldn't have been, would have told them their stories didn't matter. Their stories are part of their business and part of who they are. Our stories make us unique. They're what set us apart from the crowd, especially in a crowded landscape. So why do we tell stories for businesses? Well, we connect with them and they resonate with us. And there's something that we know how to share with others. When you're passing off info on a business, it's one thing to pass off just information, but that story not only resonates, but we remember it much better than just, a few simple facts. We connect with stories, even when it's someone that we don't know personally. For a story to really resonate, it needs to be tangible. We need to be able to see ourselves either in the story or as the protagonist. Successful stories in business resonate because somewhere in the back of our minds, we either go, that sounds like me, or that sounds like my brother, husband, sister, neighbor, friend, hairdresser, etc. It sounds like someone who's, close in our orbit, and we can kind of put that person in place and see the story come to life. Not only, might it sound like that person, but if the story is a simple and memorable one for us to kind of keep in mind, we can then relate it back to that person and go, hey, I just heard about someone sounds exactly like you, and you should call this person. And that's really what it's all about. Stories are, in my view, what set us apart from the competition. I mentioned, being in these sort of crowded landscapes. So what really sets us apart from our competitors? It is our story. It's who we are. I come from the legal world and legal advertising. I'm in Toronto. I don't know if you had mentioned that. Forgive me. So legal advertising in Canada is quite different than in the U.S. And in the U.S., I know there's a lot of superlatives that get sort of barked out in ads in a lot of industries. We don't do that up here, but just shouting and screaming that you're the best is only going to go so far, no matter what you're doing. If you are telling your people, your product is the best, the biggest, the brightest, you're the number one, it rings really shallow with folks at the end of the day. We're just sort of used to being oversold and overpromised. Instead, think of stories that are going to be what gets people to sit up and take notice. We're surrounded with stories every day, in TV, in movies, even in songs we remember. It's all about storytelling. I think to me, I read a lot of blog posts. A good blog post is like a song, has a beginning and a middle and an end. We watch TV and movies because we engage with the plot, we engage with characters. Some of it is, escapism and not based in reality, but a lot of it is. We watch a lot of, stories that we kind of go, okay, I can ground myself in this. This feels familiar. And this lets me relate to who I'm watching. Same thing with sports and politics. I'm myself not really a sports guy, but I often think of something like 30 for 30, which is a brilliant sports documentary series I think that Bill Simmons had done. A lot of them are actually on Disney Plus, I believe, right now, if you want to catch up. They're really telling the stories behind sports and sort of that human story behind sports events. The focus is on, the story is not just the final score or not just, that single moment. In sports and in politics, we tend to root for the underdog. We cheer for the person who worked hard and who did good things and gave back, and put their passion to everything that they did because we love that story. It's just part of our nature. How do stories translate into sales? Well, we think about founders and their stories in the brands that we recognize, and we're really appreciative of those. Steve Jobs had a backstory that helped make Apple the unique brand that it was, because everything about Steve Jobs' story is unique. And yes, the Steve Jobs bio is buried somewhere in that bookshelf behind me. Richard Branson's autobiography, he's on there somewhere too, is amazing because for all of his successes, he puts almost everything on the line every time he goes into a new venture. He literally bets the company. And it's crazy to me to think that he does that. Eric Yuan, who started Zoom, had his visa denied 8 different times before he was able to come into the US. These are the stories that make a founder's business unique. They don't exist in isolation. They provide lessons that, deepen the company, talking about strength, resilience, perseverance, etc. The stories of those in charge are so integral to the story of the company. We also remember product stories. They evoke feeling and emotion. We need to be able to connect with those stories to see ourselves using the product. We grew up, in the days of this hyperbolic advertising, and I think back to the Ron Popeil infomercials. But wait, there's more. Our brains have been, trained to tune a lot of that out, but what we now connect with are those stories, partly testimonials, sure, but even more involved. Talked about how someone's product or even their service really helped someone during a time in need. If you think about any company, whether they're offering a product or a service, your story has to answer the question, why? Why do we need to pick up the phone and call? The story and the why are what win every time. I say if I had a nickel for everyone who told me they didn't have a story, I'd be retired. We wouldn't be having this conversation. Everybody's got one, and you have yours as a business owner. Your clients have their own. So think about how to connect the two and weave them together, and how to make your story resonate with them, and how to make their stories part of your own. So what are some, I'm trying to get Phil up by 10:30. We'll do a little Q&A after. I know. So what are some tips for great storytelling? Number one, be relatable. As I keep talking about, the audience has to see themselves or someone they know in those shoes. Look, we grew up with fairy tales, and, I'm no exception. And, at that age, we can picture ourselves in this magical world of kings and princesses and animals and other fantasy. And that's great. But, most of us do leave that world behind as we get older. Whether we should or not is another story. But most of us leave that world behind as we get older. And instead, the stories that we connect with as we grow up are the ones that we can really relate to. They sound like us or someone we know, and so we tend to pay closer attention. Be authentic. One of the hardest parts of storytelling for so many people is letting their guard down, even just a little bit. They're taught that it's best to be, private, not to show emotion, not to let people in. I think that's a dated approach, and the pandemic, I do believe, has helped at least break some of that down. We all become acquainted with through Zoom with each other's homes and our bedrooms, and the chaos that is my bookshelf, et cetera, et cetera. We're just sort of letting people into a piece of ourselves, and it's just the start of doing that so much more. We're all just people. We're all flawed. We all have challenges. And most of us are really just trying to do our best to do some good in the world. So don't hide that authenticity. Show it off with some pride. Sounds silly, but truly have a point. Stay focused. Stories have to take a reader or listener on a journey. They don't always have to be chronological, but there's a couple things that I did very intentionally in the beginning when I was sharing my story. It was relatively chronological because that is logically how our brains follow a story. So it does help, unless you really bounce it down to the purpose. Keep it relatively short and sweet. Have that point. Why was I doing this? Well, so that like, and trust me. Someone who's just sharing, anecdotes or gets stuck on, constant anecdotes that don't weave together, it tends to get lost after a while. I just read a book, and I wrote about it yesterday, of someone who I was really looking forward to reading their memoirs, and they have interesting stories, but there was no narrative there whatsoever. And it was just like reading a jumbled mess. I stuck through it because I wanted to hear the stories, but it was, this absolute sort of jumbled meandering, and they had a ghostwriter. So I don't know what happened there. Someone should have really done some better work on that one. But it started sort of chronological and then kind of went a little all over the place and jumped around, and not good. Stories take you on a journey. Don't get your reader or your listener lost along the way. You can include detail, but try to stay focused and on task. If you divert too much or you go in too many different directions, you're at a high risk of losing your audience. don't shy away from emotions, which is part of that, piece about being authentic. Be honest about them. If you want to keep things light, make sure it's funny. If you're appealing to emotion, make it tangible. Try not to go too dark, but enough to connect. Some stories are funny, some are adventurous, some are sad, but don't shy away from the emotional component involved in that story. The goal is to be relatable, and people do have emotions, even if we like to pretend that we don't. And lastly, crucial for any story, have a call to action. A story shouldn't just linger, it should make you realize, hey, gotta sit up and take action. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we make when we're telling stories is we assume that that call to action is obvious, and it so often isn't. We assume that somebody will read about how great we are and just automatically decide to pick up the phone and call. And the brain doesn't work like that. It needs those constant reminders. So you actually have to say at the end, here's what you do. Here's how you can make a difference. Here's who you can call. Here's who to email, no matter what the story is you're telling. Here's the next steps. The whole point of telling stories is that you're not just telling them for their own sake, especially in business. You're using them as examples to illustrate how you or your product or your service can help. By the end of your story, somebody should be ready to call or email right away, but don't hesitate to give them that extra little push. Well, that was the why as to why I'm telling my story. Feel free to reach out anytime. I am only an email away. Phil and Kristen have my contact info and I'm in the Slack channel as well. So anything you're looking for a hand with in terms of sort of those sharing stories, etc. I'm more than happy to take questions. Phil, I know you got to drop off in a sec, but we can gladly chat about some of the storytelling nuances for a few minutes if you need, or if anyone has any questions at all, feel free to jump in. I will stop sharing my screen.
That was awesome, Shaun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're right on time as well. I was I was like, wow.
I probably went a little quickly, so forgive me, but hopefully it wasn't too fast.
I've got a quick question, Shaun, before I do drop off.
Sure thing.
In terms of storytelling, what I'm even seeing today is so much of a competing nature for eyeballs out there, right? I mean, there's blogs and there's emails and there's all these things. The video component that's also coming is really interesting. I love, by the way, I loved your YouTube video introducing your
Thank you
agency. That's a great one. Are there any particular storytelling elements? I understand certainly, there's a call to action for each one of those, right? I think these are all applicable, but are there any specific ones when you're thinking about a video or you're thinking about a blog post or you're thinking about an email? I mean, y'all get my email every week about what happened in Slack, and it's like sometimes I feel like if I don't get that emoji in the subject line, oh, you're not going to read it. You know what I mean? It's one of those like, we're all working through things for our clients and whatnot, but you know what I mean by that? It's like, yeah, it's so competitive for everyone's attention out there today. So maybe it's about, the real question is, are there any kind of initial hooks that you can use, along the way? And do they vary per medium, I guess, would be the corollary.
I think they do to a certain extent. I'd say think about your audience. And that's the thing that I see so many professionals just failing to do is, you just think you're just kind of going in whole hog and whoever's there is there. And don't do that. Think about, who's your target audience? Who do you really want to watch, listen, read, what have you? And what's going to hook them in? It's not about you. I mean, as much as it's maybe your story, it's really about, what's going to connect quickly with that person. And that can, like I said, vary, medium to medium. I have a podcast. I just did the video. It does differ, but if your audience is a specific client base, a specific population, really sort of give some thought to putting yourself in their shoes first, and then you work backwards from there. If that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I do have to jump, guys. Keep the Q&A going though, and thanks again, Shaun, for doing this.
Thanks, Phil, for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.
Get you guys in Slack. Thank you.
When you figure out your audience, what do you think about when it comes to stories that you put out? It's a good question, Chris. I think about sort of what's going to resonate with them. And it's tricky and you don't always know. But just sort of finding sort of an example story, an example narrative, an example hook that they can relate to. If I'm writing a blog, for example, I know that I have an eyeball for, if it's really dry, about 10 to 15 seconds. If it's, any better, maybe 30. And I'm trying to keep someone in for 2, 3 minutes. So how do I sort of, and I was down at the pier yesterday, I watched people fishing. How do you fish? How do you actually reel someone in and, go really slowly to get them to pay attention? So you start with something they're going to go, oh, hey, wait a second. So, most of my legal blogs, for example, for my lawyer clients, I do a lot of writing for lawyers, and I mean, just talking about the facts of a case will turn anybody off, even lawyers. And I say, no, no, no. Like, there is, for any case, there's a story. And what is in that story? Why are we telling the story? Because presumably we're not telling stories for nuance. We're telling stories because they actually matter to the audience. And so what is it in the story that the audience is going to connect with, that the principle of the story is going to matter to them? If that makes a little bit of sense.
I had a question for everyone,
Sure.
and I put it in the chat, which is, do you have a go-to story of your own that you already tell people, or is it very much still a work in progress? And you can chime in, speak up, add the reaction, just put it in the chat. I'm curious to see where everybody's at, because I mean, Shaun, you have, you've expressed to us that everyone's got a story, right? And I know that you and I have been chatting about, if we had all the time in the world, we'd love for everyone to go around and kind of talk about how they've displayed their story, demonstrated the things that they've experienced. So yeah, Teresa says she's still working on it. I know Kat, Alan, Danielle, what about you guys? Where are you at in this story journey?
Yeah, also still working on it. I think I'm trying to find the story to fit to my business, to like sell in that way. And I actually had a question about that. So with the story, I'm using, like, in the business sense for marketing, like you're using your own story to sell your services. But I feel like when I get to that point where I have to do the call to action, that like change feels really unauthentic. Like I've just been open about my story and then I'm like, hey, buy my services, So like, what do you have advice for that? Like change?
I don't know that I would consider it inauthentic. I think, look, there's
Yeah.
a little bit of, people are going to want to work with someone who they like and someone who's the right
Mhm.
fit. I don't know if you ever hired, like I was a recruiter, it's all about finding fit. And so, you're telling your story not just because reframe it, and that you're not telling your story just for its own sake. We could make friends or counseling or do whatever to just have someone listen to our story. In business, we're really telling our story for the purpose of making that bond to get business. So, the call to action is, hey, you now know and like me, trust me with, the services. So I don't think I don't think it's an authentic jump at all. I would consider
Yeah.
reframing them.
I like how you said it's about creating the bond, not like making the sale necessarily. It's the bond instead. So
Exactly.
Thank you.
No, and in our creative space, and I don't know, about all your work specifically, but in our creative space, there are umpteen people who do what we do. And there's enough work to go around, quite honestly, for most of us, that we don't have to step on each other's toes. What is it that makes us each unique? And what is it that's gonna, have us be the right fit? I turn down work all the time because I'll sort of, say, okay, this is not the right fit for me for this project or for this client, but it might be for so and so, and I'll make that introduction because I know that person's story, and I can say, okay, there could be a good bond here. To answer Alan your question, forgive me. Yes, I try to really take one of my big tips that I use internally is to take the lingo out of everything where I can. Just that jargon is not not usually reader and listener friendly, especially coming from law. We're the worst culprits of it. And lawyers, right, like everybody else, has a law degree, and that's just not true. So I really try to take it that step back. That's one of my goals in my work.
Considering that, Shaun, because I know you write blogs, how does like keyword research go into that and telling the story? Because you don't want to overload people with the lingo and the keywords, but you're still trying to tell a story. I'm curious about that from your perspective.
So I'll give you sort of 2 points. I I write, and I have clients all over the place. Most of the time, I have a lot of clients who don't work with keywords, but most of them are sort of easy enough to guess. If you poke around and see what other people are writing on a subject, you got a pretty good sense of what the keywords are that people are searching for. But don't forget all the search engines today prefer that plain language approach of not just like a robot hammered it out, but actually weaving them into a narrative, weaving them into a sentences, weaving them into a story frame. The other thing is, if a keyword is something that's really dense and technical, I'll take the time to explain it. Especially in law, I work with a lot of really complicated concepts. The last thing, and it used to drive me crazy when I was in practice, the last thing you want to do is just throw terminology out there and assume that people understand what you're talking about, because they don't. And they're often using those terms wrong, and they don't really get it or how it works. I was an employment lawyer. The big thing for us was constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal is very serious and very rare when it actually happens, being fired without being fired. Everybody and their mother thinks they've been constructively dismissed. They'll come in and say, oh, yeah, and then tell the full story, and that was not remotely what happened. But they saw a term on the internet and they thought, oh, hey, this sounds like me. No. So I really, work to take the time to break something down and explain what we're talking about. And so even, if it's using those keywords, it'll do it in a way that's user friendly and that's, still invoking that plain language. Does that help, Danielle? Sorry if it's long-winded.
No, that's perfect. I love that. And I love the idea of like breaking something down to even more simpler terms. I think that makes a lot of sense. And, search engine friendly still.
Yeah, exactly. And then, goes to Alan's point as well, is, don't ever, it sounds terrible, don't over assume your audience's intelligence or comprehension. I wrote a piece a while back, and it's the one that gets referenced a lot about, are you the shy kid in class? I don't know how many people were the shy kid in class once upon a time, at least in some respects. We're always the shy kid in something that we don't understand. And if we're in a group or someone's talking to us about something we don't understand, we are very rarely will we have the courage to say, I don't get this. Can you take this step back? No, we smile and nod and just hope that they change the topic. And so we know that we don't get it, but we're just trying to indicate that, either they should move on or hope they think that we're smart enough. And it's really not about intelligence, but hope that, they think we're smart enough to just kind of hang on a conversation. And that's the danger is, people will pretend like they know what's going on, and they really don't. So don't lose your audience. Really pay attention to, making sure that they are on the same page, speaking, their vernacular, that they can understand what's going on.
That's really funny, Shaun. Growing up, I was very extroverted, but I had a lot of introvert friends. And at one point in high school, I started this public speaking group, and I had my friends would come to support me, and they were, when we were chatting one-on-one, it'd be a lot of fun to hear their thoughts, and we'd be really open, really honest, really comfortable. And then when they'd go up to speak, I'm like, why aren't you saying anything? And and something that we would run into is like, I just don't think I have anything worth saying, or someone already said that, or something, something along those lines. And I was like, well, tell me what you were going to say. Like, what were you thinking? I very much doubt it was the exact carbon copy of what somebody else has mentioned. And it brings me back to the core of this message, which is like, everyone has a story, and it is worth telling, right? It's worth sharing, and maybe not everybody will respond to it, and that's okay, because if you don't want to respond to everybody anyway to begin with. But one of my questions was something along the lines of, how do you meld all the different elements of yourself into your story? I know that it's something that I've taken to relate to different opportunities, and like cover letter style is sort of like gear everything that I've done to, if I'm looking for a sustainability opportunity, to the climate crisis, right? Or if I'm looking to pivot to something that's like project management, everything that's related to organization. How do you meld all the different elements of yourself and being human into a cohesive sentence even?
It's I just think back to my friend Andy. I used to have a friend Andy who was, I think, a financial banker on Bay Street, which is like our Wall Street, very high-end banker. And then left that job, came out, went religious, started a fashion company. And, he said how I went from, Bay Street banking to being a queer Orthodox Jew designing purses, followed by, trust me, it all makes sense. And I love that. I love when Andy said, trust me, it all makes sense. It does all make sense. It's just part of who we are. It's part of our journey. So, for me, I mean, I don't apologize for it. It's part of who I am. People, are always so surprised that I left law. Well, frankly, I'm a lot happier now. I'm, less depressed and making more money. So, I'm not I'm not apologizing for that. In terms of me personally, you're asking, Christian, how I weave my story together.
Just
to
like,
use it?
yeah, with any advice that you have, because I'm putting together my website now, and there's the part of me that has, political and project management, startup experience and communications and marketing, but there's also the part of me that performs and is a vocalist and wants to go into voice acting, and I don't want to neglect either side, because I'd like to do as much as I can if given the opportunity.
Think of where they all come together and think of where they play to each of the strengths that you're putting forth. So think of sort of, what it brings to the table from what you need. So for me, look, I don't give any legal advice. Anyone can write a law blog, I suppose. I use the law because, frankly, and I hate to say it, it gets me a seat at the table. People sort of, and it's the worst thing because no one should trust a lawyer, but it does make you kind of, this isn't still recording. Oh, it is still recording. Damn it.
No, it's okay. This is a Teamwrkr
edits.
style. We've got to be honest.
Uh,
my dad's a lawyer. He says the same thing. He's like,
I
it's what
tease
gets you a
them
seat at the
constantly.
table. It's
I
what gets
tease
you a
them.
seat
I
at the
love them,
table.
but yeah, no, very much so. It does open up that door. So I'm using it, for what it's worth. Because look, I run a marketing business with no background in marketing or in business. So that's must be play with fire. What really comes through for me is the newsroom background. My journalism work sort of really frames who, um, not who, but really how I ask questions, how I engage with others, how I see the world, how I consider, a journalist has to know a little bit about everything and a whole lot of nothing. But they have to kind of be able to know enough about something to tell that story. And that's really how I frame the work that I do. So it could look like, you can frame your story, Chris, in any way that you want. You can look at mine and go, oh yeah, kid can't hold down a job. But I prefer to look at it of, hey, it's been a bouncing career path and it's really led me to the perfect avenue. So I'm grateful for it. What's the craziest story I've ever told or written? Um, I It's a wild one. I did a fundraising campaign for a pediatric ICU in Israel, for the Canadian Foundation to raise money for it, raising money for more ICU beds. And we told patient stories for their fundraising deck. And one of them was a car crash that had happened at, I'm going to get it in miles, just a second. Okay. This family of four was driving back from, I think, the mom's parents with a almost teenage son and a newborn, and they were rear-ended at over 100 miles an hour. The mother and baby daughter were killed instantly, and the father was in a coma for 2-3 weeks, and the son was touch and go for months. And both the father and son survived. Father's paraplegic. The father is are they both in wheelchairs? I can't recall. I know the son is, had lost, I think, both legs, but they survived. And that story of sort of their resilience and recovery was absolutely just harrowing and wild and just such an emotional experience to write. In terms of the crazy funny stories, I mean, those really come from my employment law days. Employment law is a wild world because people are the X factor and will always surprise you. And I used to act for employers and employees. And trust me, when you think you've seen it all, something new walks through the door and you go, oh my God, like that is something I did not think somebody would try at work. So there's a lot of that. Some of them I'm sure I couldn't share in polite company, but you'd never too surprised. So it's hard to really shock me. The problem, actually, funny enough, as a journalist, is you become really desensitized to a lot of things. I was reporting during, Arab Spring riots and the Fukushima disaster and the earthquake in Haiti, going back about 10, 12 years, and some real, there's ongoing, wars and conflicts and real disasters. And it's hard. You have to actually stop yourself and take a moment to be human, because otherwise you just won't. You'll just keep pressing through. And you don't emotionally connect with the news because you're too busy trying to write the story on a deadline. So I'm rarely, it takes a lot to be deeply affected, but you have to kind of stop yourself and make sure that happens too. No problem.
Wow. How's everyone doing? How are you how are you feeling? Really, seeing some nods. Seeing some nods. All right. Are there any final questions? Nothing's ever final because
I'll
we
put
have
my
our Slack
email in the
group.
chat just so that, and I'm in the Slack group anyway. But
Yes.